So if you didn't know, I live in the UK. And if there is one thing you should know about the UK, apart from our friendliest citizens, delicious food, etc., the UK overall sucks ass when building massive projects. It can take years to complete a project, mainly because of bureaucratic dickheads and political interference. And even when they've somehow managed to be completed, they end up costing far more than what they should be. Mainly because most, if not all, construction projects are often given to a private company under a contract where they fund it and build it, and then they get repaid over a course of a few years when it is completed, giving the private company, of course, a healthy profit and relying on hard-working taxpayers to pay the bill. But another major reason why major construction projects in the UK are often such a nightmare is mainly because of bad luck and over-ambition. We try to make the next big thing, like a high-speed tilting train or an international train station built to serve the biggest sporting events in the world, something that has never been seen before, only for bad luck to get in the way and crush that opportunity entirely. And recently, I've been reading about something that really fits that particular reason perfectly well. This is Wembley Park Tube Station in northwest London. It is served by the Jubilee and Metropolitan lines of the London Underground network. If you've been to Wembley Park several times, you probably have no doubt seen this massive thing when you exit the station. Unless you're blind or something, I don't know. This is the Wembley Stadium. It is one of the most well-known football stadiums in the world, and it is where the most historic matches ever in English football history took place. But FnafFan, what does this have to do with this certain construction project that was way too ambitious? I'm getting to that, you impatient fuck. Had things went differently, there would be no Wembley Stadium today. No football, no drunk fans, etc. But instead, there would have been a tower that would have been bigger than the Eiffel Tower in France, and would have most likely have been one of London's most iconic landmarks. But what happened? Why is there no tower standing proudly above Wembley Park today? Well, it was very close to becoming a reality, only for bad luck, money, human error, and over-ambition to ultimately crush it. This is the story of the Wembley Tower. Now, I just want to say, I know that another YouTuber by the name of Jago Hazard has already done a great video about this topic. That's the second time he's beaten me to a topic now. But to anyone who had already watched his video, don't worry, because there is a lot more information about Wembley Park and the whole tower stuff. So before we actually get into the history of the Wembley Tower itself, we first have to talk about the time when someone else tried to build their own tower in the very same area, way back in the 18th century. So back in those days, London was way more smaller, and Wembley itself used to be a rural hamlet in the countryside. Barely anything existed here, apart from a large estate that belonged to the wealthy Page family, who were a group of very successful farmers, and were one of the largest and richest families in the county of Middlesex, a former county that is now no longer a thing and has been absorbed into Greater London. Also, yes, I know, Middlesex, haha, funny name, grow up. In 1771, Richard Page, who was the landowner and owned the manor, had died, and his son, who was also called Richard, so I'm calling him Richard II to make things easier, had inherited the land and the manor from his father shortly after. A few years later, in 1792, Richard Page II decided to come up with an ambitious scheme to turn his land into a huge park and make improvements to his manor. And he had hired a man by the name of Humphrey Repton, who was a very popular architect at the time, to design it. The park that Repton had designed for Wembley Park would have been way more larger than what Wembley Park today is. The land would have went as far as Barn Hill, located in the north of Wembley, and it would have had several orchards and lodges, some of which still survive today, such as this one on Wembley Park Road. But the main attraction was, funnily enough, a Gothic tower structure situated on the top of Barn Hill, where it would offer scenic views of the parkland. It would have been quite a beautiful land, not just for Richard's family, but maybe even the locals and potential tourists. Only for Richard Page II to then say, actually, you know what? Fuck it. Wembley is a shithole. I'm going to buy a better manor. So Richard Page packed his bags and he had brought a new piece of land at a place called Flambards, located in Harrow, leaving Humphrey Repton basically looking all confused. So the land at Wembley itself was never remodelled and the manor was left unchanged. And as for the Gothic Tower itself, it was basically just left there, uncompleted, and then it was later demolished. The land in Wembley wasn't left abandoned forever though, as in 1802, the land had been bought by a London brandy merchant by the name of John Gray. And so, that was the very first attempt at building a tower in Wembley. And little did John Gray or the locals of Wembley knew that the park would nearly get another tower several years later. All thanks to a little railway line. In London 1863, the Metropolitan Railway, which would now be known as the Metropolitan Line more than 100 years later, opened, and it was the very first underground railway in the world, which would become an inspiration for several other companies to begin constructing their own underground railway lines in different shapes and sizes across the city, forming a network of underground railways that would later be known as the London Underground a century later. When the Metropolitan Railway first opened, it was a short line that ran from Farringdon to Paddington. However, the Metropolitan Railway didn't just want to thrive with one little line. They wanted to expand and attract more passengers and, of course, generate more money. So in April of 1868, the Metropolitan Railway formed a new company within the Metropolitan Railway Company itself called the Metropolitan and St John's Wood Railway. The purpose of this company was to build a double-track branch line from the Metropolitan Railway station at Baker Street and then head east from the station and head towards Finchley Road Station, which was owned by another company called the London and North Western Railway at the time. However, due to financial issues at the time, when the railway was opened, the railway consisted of just one single track and only got as far as Swiss Cottage, with two intermediate stations at St John's Wood Road and Marlborough Road. And when the railway was opened, it was a huge flop. Passenger numbers were very low in the 1870s. You see, the whole purpose of this line was to attract more people who lived outside of the city and provide the local residents with an easy and direct railway service for the local residents to work in the city. Which was a good idea on paper, except that what the Metropolitan Railway failed to notice was that there was quite literally nothing outside of the city. As I said earlier, London was a lot more smaller in those days, and in the 19th century it was still relatively small. There were no suburbs or anything like that. It was just countryside as far as the eye could see. And the places that did exist outside of London were just small and quaint villages. So naturally, the small populations at Swiss Cottage and St John's Wood at the time made little to no revenue for the extension at all. And naturally, the Metropolitan Railway shareholders were completely frustrated about this stupid decision. You see, issues like this were very common with the earlier days of railways in Britain. Laws for the railways were abysmal, and there was a lot less government intervention. Companies were allowed to just build railway lines everywhere, willy-nilly, and the whole purpose of this was to simply compete with other companies and leech passengers and revenue from each other. They didn't really think about location or profitability or viability, like how railways are planned now. So naturally, a lot of railways at the time ended up losing a lot of money because of poor passenger numbers. And it seems like the Metropolitan and St John's Wood Railway, oh god, that's such a mouthful, another one of that thing failed. And it seems like the M and SJWR was just going to be another one of those failed schemes. That is, until a man by the name of Sir Edward Watkin stepped in. Sir Edward Watkin became chairman of the Metropolitan Railway in 1872, and he was a really well-known entrepreneur in the early days of railways in Britain. Now, if there's one thing you should really know about Sir Edward Watkin, it's that he was a man who was very ambitious. With every engineering project he was in charge of and every railway he had chaired, he always wanted to make it the best of the best, and he wanted to pursue his goals with great determination, no matter how ridiculous and crazy his projects and plans were. And he never thought twice about if something he came up with could actually be achieved or not. And so, as you can imagine, Sir Edward Watkin had come up with many ridiculous schemes, such as a railway linking Manchester to fucking Paris. I'm not making this up, he was this insane. So naturally, in 1872, when Sir Edward Watkin became chairman of the Metropolitan Railway and saw how unsuccessful the Metropolitan St John's Wood Railway was, it was clear that he needed to think of something to attract passengers to his railway. At the time, the Metropolitan and St John's Wood Railway had been extended again all the way up to Harrow, stopping at places like Neeson, West Hampstead, Kilburn, and a temporary platform was built at Finchley Road Station, all in a single track line. And still, passenger numbers were incredibly low. So it seems that just carrying on and further extending the line into the countryside in the hopes of finding some form of civilization wasn't enough. So Watkin had come up with a solution. If the railway was not going to get passengers in the countryside, it needed somewhere to go. So after taking a look around at the locations where the railway went through, he eventually came across Wembley and John Gray's land. Watkin had read about Wembley before, and he read the memoirs and poems made about the area describing how beautiful the landscape looked. And so, Watkin saw the massive potential Wembley had. So in 1880, the Metropolitan Railway had approached John Gray's son, who had now taken over the land from his father, who passed away in 1828, to buy 47 acres of the land. 2 years later, they had reached a settlement, and the Metropolitan Railway had bought the land for a grand total of £32,500. And so, the park had now belonged to the Metropolitan Railway, and Sir Edward Watkin could finally start his idea to attract passengers to the Metropolitan and St John's Wood Railway extension. So what did Sir Edward Watkin want to do with Wembley? Well, he wanted to turn Wembley into a massive pleasure garden. So what pleasure gardens were back in those days was that they were basically Victorian-era Britain's equivalent of today's amusement parks. But instead of massive rides and roller coasters and whatnot, pleasure gardens usually had the basic Victorian-era amenities like tea rooms, golf courses, basically what the average rich ranker enjoys. Now, they definitely look very boring from a present-day perspective, but back in those days, pleasure gardens were a very popular option for days out. And Watkin, being the sort of guy that he is, wanted to make his pleasure garden in Wembley the best of the best. It contained so many attractions, such as tea rooms, a theatre, bandstands, golf courses, football pitches, cricket pitches, golf courses, and a lake with boat rides. And a new station would be constructed to serve it, called Wembley Park, consisting of a direct and fast train ride to Baker Street. The idea seemed foolproof. A pleasure garden that was so close to the City of London that it took just 12 minutes to get there by train seems like it would be incredibly successful and popular with tourists and visitors alike. But again, in typical Watkin fashion, Watkin felt like he needed a flagship attraction for his pleasure garden. Something big. Something grand. So, in the late 1880s, while his park began construction, Watkin decided to leave Britain and travel the world in search of inspiration. And he would later on succeed in one of the worst places in Europe.
This maze is so hard.
France. In 1889, Watkin arrived in the city of Paris in France, just in time for the opening of the 1889 Paris Exposition, a world event that marked the 100th anniversary of the storming of the Bastille, an event that sparked the French Revolution. The exposition was incredibly popular, attracting more than 32 million visitors, most likely because of its main attraction, the Eiffel Tower. Designed by the French engineer Gustave Eiffel, the Eiffel Tower was built specifically for the exposition, and it was originally built to last for a few years and then it would get torn down. But the people of Paris thought that the tower looked so magnificent that it was decided that the tower would stay around for a little while longer, and eventually it would become one of the most iconic landmarks in the world. Sir Edward Watkin had become infatuated with the Eiffel Tower and was impressed with its design. So, as a result, Watkin had found his inspiration for its main attraction as Pleasure Garden in Wembley. And when Watkin returned to England, he gathered up a team of workers to come up with a wacky idea to build a tower of his own for Wembley that would be bigger and grander than the Eiffel Tower in every shape or form. The Wembley Tower was born. So that was the story of how the Wembley Tower came into fruition. But the big question I'm sure you are all wondering is, what on earth happened to it? Well, here's the complete history of its construction. Okay, so originally, Watkin actually invited the Eiffel Tower's designer, Gustave Eiffel, to design it. But Gustave unfortunately turned him down because something, patriotic grounds, basically, my tower is better, don't copy me, you unoriginal fuck. So, Watkin decided that he was going to build his tower himself. Or, when I say he, I mean hire a bunch of guys to build it. So in 1890, Watkin had held a competition where people from various construction companies and firms would submit their own designs for the Wembley Tower, and the design with the most votes would be selected and built. A total of 68 designs were submitted. Some looked incredibly stunning. One design included a Pyramid of Giza inspired structure with hanging gardens, and some were just completely retarded. Oh, Jesus! Oh, God! Like this one, where it envisioned a spiral structure with a railway that would climb its exterior all the way up to the top. After the contest was closed, the winning entry was number 37, submitted by the Stewart, McLaren and Dunn construction firm based in London. The firm proposed an 8-legged structure that would stand at a height of 1,200 feet, which was 150 feet taller than the Eiffel Tower. The tower itself would have 2 observation decks, each one consisting of restaurants, theatres, dancing rooms, exhibitions, winter gardens, Turkish baths, and a 90-bedroom hotel. And at the top of the tower, reached by lifts, it would have housed a fresh air sanatorium and even an observatory. After the winning design was then approved for construction, Sir Edward Watkin formed a company called the International Tower Construction Company to build the tower. And Watkin appointed a civil engineer by the name of Benjamin Baker to oversee the construction. And then, construction for the tower officially began in 1892. And from then on, everything just completely fell apart with a whimper. Already, when construction of the tower began, the early signs of trouble were already beginning to show. The first major issue was the cost. So in total, when completed, the tower would cost £220,000. And originally, Watkin had hopes that the cost of the tower would be sorted out with public subscription. However, that didn't really go well, as not that many people were interested. So, while the tower was still in construction, very important detail, you'll find out why later, Watkin had decided to change up the construction plans of the tower in order to make the costs slightly cheaper. The tower would now be scaled back. Instead of standing at a height of 1,200 feet, the tower would now stand at a slightly shorter height. Still taller than the Eiffel Tower, but not as big. As for the base, the tower would now be a 4-legged structure instead of an 8-legged structure, like it was originally meant to be. As for the park itself, in May 1894, Wembley Park had officially opened to the public, with the tower still in construction. Now, why on earth would you open a park when your main attraction is still in construction, I hear you ask? Well, realizing that the price tag for the tower would still be quite large, even with its scaled back design, Watkin had come up with a plan to raise funds for the tower by allowing visitors to pay to climb the structure and have a look at the construction. Yeah, seriously, people could actually climb the tower whilst it was still in construction. This was the 19th century, bear in mind. Health and safety was practically non-existent. And initially, at first, Watkin's plan had gone well. The park attracted more than 12,000 visitors during 1895, and it was making a huge profit. So it seems like the tower would be successfully finished with the money it needed. However, things got bad again. The popularity of the park was very short-lived. Once the whole novelty of Wembley began to die off, visitor numbers to the tower declined. Fundraising was incredibly hard. In total, the company had raised only a mere £27,000 worth of donations, nowhere near the required total amount of money it needed to pay for the construction. As a result, construction fell massively behind schedule, with the first stage of the tower having to have just been completed in September of 1895. To make things even worse, Watkin retired at that same year due to ill health, so now the construction company was pretty much left on its own. It seems like the tower wasn't going to get finished for a while, or maybe it would not have been completed at all. However, the Wembley Tower would eventually meet its demise due to one big fatal error. So, remember when I said that during construction, the tower had to be scaled back to a 4-legged structure? Well, during construction, the foundations had been laid out for an 8-legged structure, not the 4-legged structure that was later on decided instead. But what the construction company failed to overlook was that they had already laid out the foundations for the 8-legged structure, not long after it was decided that the tower would have 4 legs instead. And they had forgot to change the foundations in order to accommodate the new 4-legged structure. So, as a result, as the 4-legged tower got bigger and more heavier, the legs increased more and more in pressure. So eventually, when the tower got too heavy for the foundations to handle, the tower began to sink and subsidize into the ground. From then on, it was clear that the tower was going nowhere. The subsidizing structure and the financial issues were proving to be too much for the International Tower Construction Company to handle. And so, in 1899, the company went bust and construction was permanently halted. And then, in 1901, it was declared unsafe and the tower was closed to the public. And the tower was just left there, abandoned, left to rot. Far from being a magnificent structure that would attract millions of visitors, it had now become an embarrassing eyesore to the public. And it gained some rather comedic nicknames such as Watkin's Folly and the London Stump. Around this time, Watkin would pass away, so at the very least he was saved from this embarrassment. But the failed tower wouldn't stay around for long, as in 1907, the tower was finally torn down and scrapped. And that was the end for the Wembley Tower. While the Wembley Tower was a massive failure, the park itself and the station remained. On the contrary, it was still a massive success. Wembley Park would later on become a part of London's suburbs with the Metropolitan Railway's Metroland scheme, a plan where it had aimed to build suburban developments at every station in rural Middlesex. In 1924, the British government would host the British Empire exhibition in Wembley Park, with a massive football stadium located on the same spot where the Wembley Tower would have stood. And from then on, the park continued to grow and change drastically. With a newly rebuilt stadium and huge housing developments, Wembley Park eventually evolved into the current Wembley Park that we all know and love. So in a way, Sir Edward Watkin's idea of creating a popular tourist destination outside of London with the sole purpose of attracting more passengers onto his failed railway extension was not completely ruined. As for the Wembley Tower itself, nothing remains. There's pretty much 0 pieces of evidence that a tower had even stood here. The foundations of the Wembley Tower itself, however, still remains, although they have been buried beneath the current Wembley Stadium. In fact, in 2002, when the old Wembley Stadium was being rebuilt into the current Wembley Stadium, the foundations of the Wembley Tower were briefly uncovered. So had the old Wembley Stadium had never been rebuilt, the tower would have been most likely forgotten about forever, with the only evidence of its existence being a few sketches. The Wembley Tower was a project that was, quite frankly, doomed from the start. It was made purely with the intentions to rival another, and it was made by people who had little to no experience nor the money to even make a large and grand structure, and it had all fallen apart thanks to human error. But while the tower itself may have failed and it was never finished, it still played a large role in London's development. It helped to bring loads of tourists and visitors to Wembley Park, bringing passengers onto the Metropolitan and St John's Wood Railway, which seems like it would be a massive flop. It may have been an overambitious project, but its legacy still lives on.